Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. Today we speak with J.P. Gance about what can be done to rebuild the rather important institution of marriage. Let's go. Givers, Doers, and Thinkers introduces listeners to the fascinating people and important ideas at the heart of American civil society. We speak with philanthropists, nonprofit leaders, social entrepreneurs, historians, journalists, and anyone else who will help us understand contemporary civil society's achievements and failures. We also sprinkle in practical advice for nonprofit leaders and fundraisers. My name is Jeremy Beer, and thanks for joining us. JP, it's a pleasure to have you with us and for everyone else with us as well. I think this is like our 17th or 18th episode I've recorded, and it's interesting. So several of our thinker guests, not necessarily planned, have brought up marriage. They tend to speak to us about marriage. It's whether it was Tim Carney or Brad Wilcox. It's on people's minds. It's health or its lack thereof. The relation of class to marriage patterns, marriage and faith, marriage and civil society. So I'm happy to talk to you today because you are not only a thinker, but also a doer as the founder and president of Communio. And you're working at a very practical level to strengthen marriage and families. So it's a pleasure to have you as our guest.
Yeah, it's really great to be here. And those two guys, Brad Wilcox and Tim Carney, are just fabulous thinkers, and I consider friends.
Well, that's great. And I'm glad you all are kind of plowing in the same field. What would you say, before we get to your doing here in a bit, I want to make sure we define the problem as you see it. How would you define or characterize the problem we're facing with respect to marriage today?
Yeah, I don't think it's hyperbolic that marriage, when we think about marriage, that it's really a survival issue for the West. Okay, and a lot of people talk about it. Whether it's David Brooks or Charles Murray or Brad Wilcox or Tim Carney or Robert Putnam or Raj Chetty. I think there's broad agreement, left, right, center, that marriage is absolutely critical to the mix of civil society and human civilization. I think you'd look at the Nobel laureate in economics, Gary Becker. He won the Nobel Prize because of his research relating to the efficient formation of human capital. That human capital is most effectively and efficiently created in a two-parent married family. And for that, he won the Nobel Prize. I doubt he would win it today for that research, but he did win it in the 1990s, which is an ancient history. Now, when you look at so it's critical for economics. I had a conversation years ago with Kirk Adams, who was the chief of staff for Governor Ducey. And Kirk told me, in his opinion, 80% of Arizona's state budget was spending as a result of the collapse of the family, right? So our prison, there's a saying in prison ministry that on Mother's Day, prisoners frequently ask for cards to send their mothers, but on Father's Day, almost no Father's Day cards go out. Right? So when we look at its impact on the state, it's pretty substantial. And so much philanthropy, really, whether it's K-12 education reform, whether it's anti-poverty work of different varieties, whether it's mental health, which is very much in vogue at the moment to be thinking about from a philanthropy perspective. All of it is impacted downstream of the family. So you look at our politics. Our politics increasingly becomes more goal line to goal line rather than between the 40-yard line, so to speak. In the collapse of the family. So we have more political extremism because we no longer, I think, and as other thinkers have argued, that we gain our identity through our family and through our connection to to our dads, and that is that's vanishing, and so it fuels that. And then maybe finally, I would note the collapse of marriage in the family is driving the almost the entire collapse of religion in the West can be explained by this one factor. We have done a lot of commissioning a lot of research on this, but millennials are more affiliated with no religious views than any other prior generation, right? And much more so than Gen X, and much more so than baby boomers. But in our research that we partnered with Dr. Mark Regnerus on, what we found was that if a millennial has grown up in a constantly married home, they have almost no difference in how frequently they go to church when compared to a baby boomer.
That's amazing. When I read that in something you had written, I've never seen that stated before. Maybe I've just missed it, but that's extraordinary. It's not about that would seem to indicate that it accounts for almost all the difference. There's really no reason to go around hunting for other variables in that case. Right.
In fact, a good friend of mine, Dr. Paul Vitz, who's the co-founder of the Institute for Psychological Sciences and Divine Mercy University here in Northern Virginia, he wrote the book Faith of the Fatherless, and he goes through a psychoanalysis of atheism. And he told me about a year ago in an interview I did with him, he said that, it's really hard to know the Father's love unless you first experienced a Father's love, right? That is, for those of us who are Christians, it's not accidental that God revealed himself as Father, that this is core to who he is. And the collapse of the family it's not surprising then if we can't get if we don't understand the family and we don't understand the love that comes through a family, we're not going to understand Trinitarian love, and we're not going to be able to really get Ephesians 5, right? St. Paul's great analogy between Christ's love of the church being the analogy between that and the love of a husband with a wife, right? It being an icon of that.
Okay, so basically, you have started this off here, JP. We're already running at a high speed, right? So marriage is about the survival of the West. Decline in marriage impacts theological understanding, religious practice, a crisis of identity. You noted. I'm just going through all the things that seem to be related to causally related as consequences to decline in marriage. Talk a little bit more about the crisis and identity part and the political extremism part before we move on from this. I want to draw out from you how marriage is related to those two things that are happening in our culture.
And if I might, I just want to point out, because sometimes somebody listening to this podcast might ask, this is more correlation, not causation, right? There's few factors that more definitively obliterate that question than marriage, because we can look at family of origin, right? People who have an intact family of origin, there's massive differences in how they're in their faith practice, in their political views, in their social mobility. And so at no point could you say, well, the person's more conservative. That's why they chose to come from an intact family. The intact family precedes it chronologically in time and definitively resolves that question. So I just want to throw that out there to anybody who might be thinking about or wrestling with the causal versus corollary issues. Now, as it relates to your question about fueling our political divide, this gets more at we no longer know how to disagree in our country. We don't know how to respectfully disagree. We don't know how to resolve conflict. All of those things are things learned in the first school, which is the home. and that comes. The home is most effectively. At least the data is overwhelming that shows that an intact married home produces the best outcomes for kids. And so if I don't see, for instance, my dad model anger and model healthy anger and healthy disagreement, I don't see my mom and dad resolve conflict in a healthy way and in a respectful way. If I don't have somebody, preferably two parents, helping to resolve sibling conflict, which is super, very frequent. My wife and I, we have 8 kids. And know all about sibling conflict, and if we don't jump in from time to time to help them resolve those issues, help them model conflict resolution, that's a problem. So I think on one level, what fuels our political extremism is the inability to be able to relate to those who we disagree with in a healthy way. That's one area. Another area that I think it fuels political extremism is that when we lack a strong family identity, we crave identity and meaning. And if we don't get that in the home, we're going to get it from somewhere else. And I already noted that the collapse of family drives the collapse of faith. Both those things are deeply teleological, right? They're deeply purpose giving. And as those collapse, right, then we crave the kind of teleology, the type of purpose that used to come from those things, right, from faith and family. And so we look at many people and they see their political identity and they treat their political identity as really a sort of all-encompassing identity.
It's completely primary. The ideology essentially fills the vacuum left by broken families.
That's right. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Very insightful. Well, tell me. Let me change tracks a little bit here. I think we'll come back to what you're talking about just now here in a little while. But let's talk about attempted fixes. You wrote a piece a couple of years ago for the Washington Examiner, I think it was, detailing federal government attempts to strengthen marriage and their remarkable failure. Can you tell us about that? What's been in recent years and why it failed?
No, and this also comes out of my experience in being the executive vice president at the Philanthropy Roundtable. The federal marriage program was largely inspired by some successful work done at the community marriage level, influenced by some great successes by amazing funders like the McClellan Foundation and work in Chattanooga, Tennessee, a really all-star in this space, Julie Baumgardner, and some other work in that, along that line. And so the feds saw something that was working and they decided to jump in and fuel it. And so they created a large, ongoing national grant to where organizations could apply for funding if they were willing to work on promoting couples relationship education or marriage enrichment. And so a lot of funders, on one level it failed because a lot of funders thought that, okay, the feds have got this $100 million. That was, many, many multiples in the money going into the space at the time, at least at the community level. And so it had the impact of moving, we saw this at the Philanthropy Roundtable, moving private philanthropy away from the marriage space. The other thing it did was it made the spending there increasingly ineffective. And I think very much of Robert Rector, who helped create this program, I think it was a well-intentioned idea, but the reality is they use the money to basically had to be run by secular nonprofits, couldn't run in churches and by churches, and then the funding had to be incentivized to be spent on lower income populations. And on each of those different levels, it became problematic in my estimation. First, on funding separate nonprofits. Okay, I always say this, I describe it this way. At what point do you go to an organization that you don't know exists to get help for a problem that you don't know you have? And so that was basically what frequently happened in the community marriage organizations. And so much of the spending, it was close to $5,000 a person served in many cases. It was so high because they had to create a pipeline for people to come and show up. Okay, the other item, a huge factor in motivation is faith. So many of the people working in this vineyard through the federal grants were believing Christians, but they couldn't bring their faith to the table in service of the mission. And what we began to find with churches is that churches themselves are inherently stickier, right? So if my wife and I meet somebody because of going to a date night at a church, I am more likely. What we found is you're more likely to interact with that couple or that person, the other, say, subject of the program, let's say, in a context outside of the program. I might invite them over for dinner. I might invite the guy out for a beer. I'm more likely to interact with them in a way that's beyond the context of grant, whereas that's not necessarily the case for these federal programs. So we thought they were also not as sticky, and so for a lot of reasons, those programs have been less than effective, and I think they've given philanthropists the wrong impression that good work in this area is not possible, that it's intractable, and that's, I think, the final major concern I have with the federal program.
Well, we're going to get to your work that counters that idea in Jacksonville here in a second, but let me ask you before you talk to us about that. Churches themselves. So that's the federal government, but you give a statistic somewhere that's somewhat depressing. 80% of evangelical churches, 82% of Catholic parishes, and 92% of mainline Protestant churches spend $0 on marriage ministry right now. Were you surprised by that when you found it?
No, it's funny. We were not surprised by that. And sometimes you need to do sometimes you have to do a study to determine whether or not bachelors are single, because not everybody understands that from time to time. And in this sense, we partner with the Barna Group, and to get at that number, it was a large survey, a statistically representative sample of churches that were evangelical, mainline, and Catholic. And what we understood, what our hypothesis was, is that the sexual revolution began in 1960. I don't think it's a great mystery to sociologists who've looked at this and the breakdown of the family to understand that the sexual revolution itself and the decoupling of sex from marriage and sex from procreation and the many different consequences of that has fueled the decline of the family. That's not shocking or groundbreaking. What is important is that in Christianity, the church frequently is reactive, and that's okay. The church, there's a crisis. At some point, the church reacts, whether it's a disagreement on the Trinity, and then there's a council in the 4th century, or whether it's a plague and pagans are fleeing Rome and the Christians are running in, or whether it's widespread alcoholism in the 19th century in the U.S. and the evangelical church sprang to action in so many ways with the very effective temperance movement, that the church reacts to challenges. And up until the 1960s, everything that we breathed reinforced in the West, at least over about a 1,000-year plus period, reinforced a culture of marriage. And that's not to say that there weren't problems and there weren't challenges in the past and that everything in the past was good. That's not the case. But at the very least, there was that widespread expectation of marriage. That evaporated, and the church has not yet responded to the change cultural dynamic. It'd be weird to have a marriage ministry in, the 1790s at a Baptist church in Philadelphia. I can't imagine that being, much of a need, but things have changed.
Yeah, very much so. Well, we'll be right back with JP Gance, founder and president of Communio, to talk about something that has worked. And Communio has shown it and is showing it. We'll be right back to talk about that with JP Gance. All right, we are here with Owen Thomas, who is American Philanthropic's healthcare consultant, which is pretty cool. How are you doing, Owen?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
So there's something different for a lot of our listeners, of course, won't know the specifics of kind of healthcare fundraising, but there's something called grateful patient fundraising in the healthcare sector. Can you just tell us quickly what that is, and maybe if there's a lesson to be extrapolated from it for people who are doing philanthropy outside the healthcare sector?
Sure. So grateful patient fundraising, just to really boil it down and put it simply, it's fundraising that provides an opportunity for patients who've received care at a hospital or a healthcare organization, and they want to give back in some way. They want to show their gratitude for the care that they've received. So when you see it in action, it's really a joyous occasion. Grateful patients have typically had a good experience in the care that they've received. And, maybe their life was saved, the quality of life for themselves or family members was improved, and they want to show their gratitude in some way. And when they access, think about it in your own life, when you access healthcare at a hospital, that's a pretty sensitive time in your life, and there's a lot of anxiety. And, a lot of times our hospitals play a critical role in giving us the care that we need to stay alive or improve our lives. So when you talk about grateful patient fundraising, it's really an opportunity for patients to give back in some way and show their gratitude. When I think about the grateful patients that I've worked with before, they ask themselves, if not me, who? Who will help our community? Who will help our hospital improve the quality of life for everyone? So, grateful patients, they fund things such as hospital buildings, equipment. But, a lot of times it comes down to improving patient care. And that's a big focus on what grateful patient fundraising is all about, providing folks an opportunity to give back in a way that they might not otherwise know about.
Yeah, and they want to give back because they've been given something of, in this case, of course, nearly inestimable value. Correct. So maybe the principle that applies across the board for fundraising is the importance of giving to your donors, giving as much of value as you can to them first before you expect a lot back from them, so to speak.
Oh, sure. And it's a thoughtful conversation. It's not a transactional conversation. You're really providing an opportunity for folks to give back and make a difference in somebody else's life.
Yeah, that strikes me as another principle we could extrapolate is sort of the showing that there are high stakes in play when you're doing major gifts fundraising, that there's something really matters. There's something really right. At stake in the conversation you're having. Anything else we should know about grateful patient fundraising?
Well, I think, sometimes hospitals would like to fund certain priorities, but they just don't have the resources to do it. And I think a lot of times grateful patient fundraising can help fill the gap. If there's not a fundraising plan in place, I think hospitals should take a hard look at what are our funding priorities and how can our patients help us get there? A lot of times the resources are stretched thin. And I think having a plan in place can really enhance the services that the hospital provides and really enhance their financial ability to provide those services.
Just like the rest of the nonprofit sector, there's plenty of need. Thank you, Owen, for taking the time to be with us.
Hey, thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for having me.
We are back with JP Gance, founder and president of Communio, talking about Communio's work and others' work to arrest the decline of marriage, or if that's even possible. JP, you all did a very innovative program in 3 cities across the country: Dayton, Phoenix, and Jacksonville, if I have that correct. It started, I don't know how many years ago now, 7 years ago or so?
Yeah, it was actually, the treatment started in 2016. The design of it, when we started brainstorming it and building it, it was in 2014. So yeah, 7.
And then but you've now gone through, you've completed it, and it's interesting. You found that you could make a measurable difference in marriage in certain ways, and in certain ways it was harder than maybe you thought, and you learned some lessons. Talk us through this whole experiment and what you found.
Yeah, and Jeremy, we were working with business leaders, guys, entrepreneurs mostly, folks who had built successful companies in designing this. And the great thing about working with entrepreneurs is if they're a successful entrepreneur, they're used to doing work in areas that are high risk, right? That most businesses fail. And the key in business is frequently to fail fast if you fail and iterate. And that was the approach they pushed us on, right? To if something's not working, fail fast. And we rapidly iterate. We took 3 different approaches in 3 different cities. Some of the things that there's a number of things that we learned. One, for instance, we brought micro-targeting and digital marketing outreach and really high-level consumer product marketing to bear for this mission. And it's frequently it's used in business, it's used in politics, it's not frequently used in ministry. And so one of our hypotheses was if we could support effective organizations in this space with that would be helpful and transformative. What it was, we found ways not to use it, and we found a lot of ways that was really wasteful by mistake. By just trying it and it didn't work. When you try to move somebody too rapidly to a program, right? We knew that couples relationship education was really effective if you can get somebody into it. And the challenge is if you accelerate somebody too quickly through marketing to take that step of an 8-hour class, it's you get really high costs, right? Which is the federal program realized, and we realized as well. And so we created our ministry engagement ladder, which came out of our learnings in Jacksonville and Phoenix and Dayton there, in serving churches, which is a much lower cost way to bring in people. We also learned that churches were transformative, right? So we worked with churches, we worked with secular nonprofits, faith-based nonprofits. What we recognized was across the board, when you look at all the different types of organizations, the most efficient and effective organizations for building a local culture around marriage was the church. And there's a number of reasons for it. Obviously,
back to the stickiness that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, stickiness is a really big deal. I would argue, obviously, the power and importance of the gospel is a big part of that. The other is the other important factor is that there is less stigma associated. Believe it or not, if let's say your local Boys and Girls Club or your local Y is hosting a date night, okay, there is if I tell my friends I'm going to the Y for a date night, it communicates something different. Or for instance, going to your local Marriage Incorporated, right? Your local federal grantee for marriage work, that communicates something different than going to something at First Baptist or St. Mary's communicates. And it was easier to get people to go actually to a church, including people who are unchurched. It was easier to get them to go to a church than to get them to go to a secular organization. I get this question oftentimes from secular philanthropists or philanthropists who don't have any faith, particular faith perspective of what's the most effective way to get those who don't go to church. Actually, we found that churches are still one of the best ways to get people who don't go to church. more efficient than any other organization that we worked with. So,
were people more likely to show up at the church, JP? Or did they feel like it was maybe somewhat ironically, a less judgmental atmosphere or anything like that? Or
I think one of the issues is a lot of other local organizations are used to receiving grants to support low-income populations, and so I think this is just a working hypothesis on it. Is we could get lower-income folks to go to churches just as easily as they would go to another organization. It's the middle-income folks didn't. They didn't want to communicate that they were needy by going to a local community-based organization that's more commonly associated with need-based charity.
That makes sense. So you found, and then you also learned that something happened in Jacksonville that was better than in Phoenix and Dayton. And what was that? What was that finding all about?
Yeah, it was a few things. So we had anchor partners in each city, and 3 different types of anchor partners. They were like the front-facing brand of the larger initiative. In Dayton, we found the individual that the anchor organization you worked with was very accustomed to working as a government grant recipient, and in the delivery of a person served costs were just so frequently high in what they did. And we were trying to get them down to about $40 a person served, and they were used to $8,000 or $9,000 a person served. And what we realized in Dayton was we didn't have a good and effective partner for what we were trying to achieve. Not that the organization wasn't good and effective, but not in what we were trying to get them to do. And then in Phoenix, when we did our work in Phoenix, Phoenix was close to 5 times the size of Duval County, which and we did not adjust our budget by a 5x approach. The other thing that we didn't do was with our anchor partners when we were providing the marketing and both marketing support and targeting support and for each of the frontline organizations. And what we recognized in Jacksonville was we really narrowly focused on divorce reduction there as a programmatic widget. In Phoenix, our local partner, and we didn't dissuade them from doing this, focused on a suite of program offerings that included divorce reduction, but included parenting. It included a program for single parents. It was basically too diversified in our outreach, and so we didn't get the volume in Phoenix, both in terms of program delivery and in the diversification of the programming in Phoenix when you compare it to Jacksonville. So those are just some of the things that were different about the approaches. We thought of each city as we called them cultural enterprise zones within our planning, and we just thought of them as laboratories to try different things. And at the end of the first year, element of what we did was we incentivized what we call them relationship champion organizations to come in and focus on our cities. And the reality was they were mostly content generators. And we quickly realized that at the end of the day, what they were doing is really trying to get frontline organizations to distribute the content. And we were paying a serious amount of money to get those organizations to collaborate. And we realized it'd be a lot more efficient to go right to the frontline organizational level, which we saw the church as the most efficient frontline organization, that you could actually cut costs substantially. We ended up moving people in year one, about 47,000 people through 4-hour longer programming in our cities at a cost of $261 a cost per person. We got that down to $45 a cost per person in the second year by re-architecting around the frontline retail organization. And we basically, that informed our major strategic pivot, which is serve the church, empower them to be the hero, and that's everything that we do. So we think of ourselves as a business to business, as a B2B, and if we do our job right, nobody in the pews will ever see the Communio brand. We don't. That's not important to us. Okay, I just say to our team, I don't know who does the corrugated boxes for McDonald's. I doubt McDonald's does it themselves. They probably have a vendor who creates it for them. And I'll bet that vendor feels like he does pretty well. And in the same way, that's how we need to think of, ourselves as, that box maker wants McDonald's to do really well. And in our sense, in our analogy, we want the churches to do really well. And we don't need the churches people to know about Communio. The staff at the church know all about us, and that's how we operate.
And just to close the loop, how it cashed out in Jacksonville was you actually did significantly and measurably reduce the divorce rate in Jacksonville because of the work these churches are doing on the front lines, correct?
That's right. It dropped 24% in that 3-year period, and it held in 2019. It went down to a 27% decline.
Are the churches continuing to do a lot of this?
A lot of the churches are, and we had an amazing anchor partner in partnership in this experiment. I want to single out Richard Albertson, who's a good friend, and Dennis Stoika, who's a good friend. They chairman and president of Live the Life. They were our anchor partner there, and in running the experiment, and they. That decline was substantial. Dr. Brad Wilcox did an independent evaluation of our work and found there was no explanation for that decline other than our work in the market. And so now we've been taking the core learnings and working to replicate them both at the individual frontline level and working with individual churches who want to partner with us, and in establishing new citywide initiatives.
How you may not know a scientific answer to this question yet, but how much does it matter the content, the specific content of what the churches are providing in this relationship?
Yeah, it does matter a lot. Okay, so Dr. Scott Stanley, who is probably the leading academic in the field of couples relationship education, which is a very well-researched field, was a consultant to us in the design phase of our work. And he would tell you in the research is that there's a lot of different types of content that can work. Okay, but it needs to have 3 core ingredients. These are the 3 legs of an effective piece of couples relationship education. Number 1, it needs to teach skills-based. It needs to have teach the skills for effective communication and conflict resolution. Okay. It's different than being preached at. Okay, a lot of churches will just give a sermon or a homily, or you go to a diocesan, all-day symposium where experts talk at you. That's not effective. Okay, what is effective is a program that helps a couple practice the skills on communication and conflict resolution. Number 2 is setting setting mutual and shared expectations. Okay, so does the program help a couple with the practice of setting a routine and shared mutual expectations? If you think of almost 100% of all marital conflict comes from these two areas, right? A couple, someone was expecting, a couple gets married and someone's working late hours, and they thought they were going to be able to spend more time together, and they didn't, or they thought things weren't going to be as hard from raising their kids' perspective in those first years of child rearing, and that they'd have more help from a spouse, or things about different expectations on sex or finances, right? And then the inability to have a healthy line of communication on how to resolve that, right? So those are the two big ingredients. The third is the program should reinforce a lifelong commitment to marriage, right? So if a program checks all three of those boxes, then the program will have a measurable impact. And so Communio, well, for our part, what makes us very strange in the field is we do not author programmatic content at the end user level. We recognize that space is really crowded, and most organizations are designed around monetizing the sale of content, which, God bless them, it's really important. But we recognize that a lot of researchers argue that couples relationship education usually only goes to people who self-actualize for it. There's a lot more people who need it that don't self-actualize, right? And so our entire model is around solving that problem, helping a church solve for that problem, doing outreach into a community and to their membership to get those who most need couples relationship education to adopt it and use it. And that's through, what we would call our consultative approach, which is the data-informed full circle relationship ministry, and helping a church use data to diagnose problems in their congregation and in their community, and then using data to do targeted outreach into their congregation, into their community around each stage of relationship life. And they do that outreach through a framework we call the ministry engagement ladder, as I've maybe referenced a moment ago, is a multi-layered process of engagement with reaching somebody who's cold in terms of relationship with the church, has no relationship with the church, draws somebody in first through some digital engagement, into then fun in-person engagement around relationship health, like a date night experience, and then into ongoing engagement where you build a community of couples interested in investing in relationship health, and then moving them ultimately. But that third level is still fun and engaging, not programmatic yet. And then ultimately, you're trying to get them to take that last step we call the growth journey. That's skills-based content. It's one of these 4 to 8 hour programs that we would curate to a church, help them select the right one. A suburban Catholic church is going to look very different than an urban Hispanic evangelical church, right? And helping that church figure out what makes sense for them, and so we consult with them to build out each layer of that ministry engagement ladder and each element of that systematic strategy of a full circle relationship ministry.
And you've pointed out, I think, that not only is this ultimately going to, we hope, and you see it happen, strengthen marriage and family in the surrounding community or in the congregation itself, maybe both, but it also will boost church attendance and giving and have all sorts of other good effects on the churches that participate.
Right. Our church, it turns out there was a pastor out in Odessa, Texas, where we're doing work, and I was speaking to his leadership team with our staff out there, where we're doing a citywide initiative, and something clicked in the pastor. He said, "We already get this." He said, him talking to his other pastor leaders, and he said, "When we go and do mission work in the third world, what do? We don't begin by preaching the gospel. We begin by digging wells and providing for the basic needs of the community. And once people know that we love them, they want to know why. And then we can share with them the gospel." And in the first world, people aren't dying of thirst, literally, but they are dying from a thirst for good and healthy relationships, right? So much that's lacking is there's so much loneliness, right? And this he saw as the first world equivalent of providing for that needs-based assistance for people, whether they're upper middle class down to lower income. There's a nihilism that has swept our culture that this speaks to, and that's really the great benefit, what drives the church growth that we've seen. Churches that we worked with in our experiment phase, 33 of them that benchmarked their findings for us, saw a 23% increase in attendance, 28% increase in giving. The churches we're working with now, it's during the pandemic and things have closed, but I can say anecdotally, I'm working with a parish down in Florida in the migrant farm area of the sugarcane fields right near Lake Okeechobee. And they just did their first outreach event February 13th. They're doing their next one March 13th. And they had, at this time, they had about 40 couples pay to come to their first date night experience. Of those, about half were not regular attendees at Mass at this Catholic parish. And the pastor has already told me that several of the men who had come to that, he's seen at Mass already coming afterwards for the first time, showing up in that small parish. And when you provide, when you show people value, right? When they get something out of it, then you can start sharing with them more. You've earned the trust to share more of the gospel with them, and that's really what we're seeing.
You think you can, I assume, reduce divorce rates in these churches you're working with in the communities that they're embedded within? What about increasing the marriage rate? Is that a harder nut to crack?
You're absolutely right. It is absolutely a harder nut to crack, but it's one we are working hard to crack. We have to crack it. Okay, the future of the church and the future of the West is dependent upon it. I think just by way of sort of a parenthetical pause, I'll say that whether it's Japan, whether it's Poland, Hungary, whether it's here in the U.S., as fertility rates have collapsed, that's collapsed as a fruit of the collapse of marriage, right? Married people tend to have more kids. And that needs to be solved. So how to solve it? We've been, there's a couple of good academic theories that I subscribe to. Basically, the sex ratio gap is probably the biggest driver mathematically in the drive of marriage, right? As men, for instance, in churches, there's a massive gap between single, unaffiliated men or single men who go to church and single women within the never married demographic, upwards of 80-20. Okay. There's a lot of evidence at the county level, and I'm going to cite the book Datanomics here, written by John Berger, not coming from a church perspective. He's a business writer for Fortune. In there, he has a lot of evidence that at the county level, a sex ratio gap in college diplomas at the county level drives increases or decreases in the marriage rate. Right now, we're approaching 40% more women graduate with a college degree than men. So if you've ever known, a single woman that you think very highly of and you'd love to set them up with a good guy and then you struggle to think of who that guy is, it's probably because he doesn't exist, because there's mathematically very few of them when compared. And women generally don't marry someone who is of lower academic attainment. So this is a huge factor. And so we talk with our churches within the single side of our relationship ministry to think intentionally about how to bring it to greater sex ratio balance by being very intentional to target men in your ministry and doing outreach for singles that a guy would be more likely to show up to, because the data says the women are already there. in our survey and modeling that we do with churches. The guys are just lacking, and so there's a lot of creative ways to do it. One of the things is really, for instance, I think very highly of a ministry out of Kansas City that I think is very cutting edge, called City on the Hill, and it is a young adult ministry that does great at engaging the hardest demographic to find, which is single men who are otherwise unaffiliated, and they run basically sports leagues, and then each of the teams has basically a discipler, on the team, and they try to move men who show up to drink beer and play flag football or softball or kickball, move them into small groups, right, and bring them into church affiliation. And the founders of it are I believe, are former Focus missionaries with the Fellowship of Catholic University students, and just super dynamic. I think they've hit on something that bears great promise. And so when we talk to churches, it's helping them come up with the kind of creative outreach on the single side. So you got to increase engagement there. The other thing, by the way, is churches should be prioritizing marrying people on campus. Okay, this is not a lot of churches on the evangelical side. Frequently, the churches do not do marrying. Don't marry folks on campuses, and that reduces the likelihood of the churches doing the formation for the couples ahead of time. On the Catholic side, the greater challenge is we put up all sorts of barriers to why a couple, usually a couple shows up, and it begins with an interrogation by the church lady. And
that's a great way to start things out.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then there's usually a large fee associated with using the church. I think diocese, and my advice has been get rid of your fees associated with using the church for weddings. Even if you look at it from a secular business perspective, these are prospective customers, right? Long-term customers. I'm just boiling everything down just to say, if you don't care about it from an evangelization perspective, think about it from if somebody will become a lifelong member of your. If you're thinking about converting somebody to becoming a lifelong customer of your business, why would you put up every barrier you could, right? And I'm not suggesting in any way that Catholic parishes move away from the significant doctrinal substance of the Catholic Church's teachings on these issues.
Yeah. Well, and one more thing, as we kind of hit the end here, you talk all these very practical, like the sex ratio problem, the problem that we don't have the single men, these kind of economic barriers. There's also, I thought of you, JP, as I was preparing for this podcast, in terms of your theory of change. I know there's a few components. We won't go into all of it, but one of them is when you're trying to bring out a big social change, like cultural storytelling is a big part of that. Like, what are the stories people are getting from the news and entertainment, Hollywood, and all that sort of thing. That's got to be another barrier here, because one thing that happened just a few days before we're recording this is a stupid little thing, but there's no longer going to be a Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head. And I thought of you when that news came out because, well, presumably they are representative of a married couple, and they indicate a certain regard, just a assumption, that potato heads get married like everybody else. And that's gone now. So it seems like there's very little stomach even in the corporate world for even lightly promoting the institution of marriage. How do you fight that headwind if you think marriage is really important?
You've hit at a huge uphill, an important battle for those who care about this issue to have to engage in. And in our research, at the start of the Culture Freedom Initiative, we partnered with a company and did long form one-on-one interviews with millennials who had gotten married and were non-college graduates. Okay, so based on Charles Murray's research, this is the group least likely to get married. And so we found those few that did get married and did long-form 90-minute interviews, trying to uncover the emotional driver of that decision of why they got married. One of the things that our research in it, we ended up titling it, and we have an instructional a video on it for our church clients called Beyond Fairy Tales. One of the big emotional drivers that we found was what frequently came up in the research was people talked about the stories that they were told as kids. Disney, like Little Mermaid, My Little Mermaid, Cinderella. Millennials have seared into their mind all these Disney movies. And how do the Disney movies end? They always end in the classical concept of a comedy. And a classical comedy ends with a wedding. And Disney has almost entirely gotten away from the classical comedy in all of their kids' stories, right? They don't end this way. And so whether it's Mr. Potato Head or now, I've understood that Hasbro has kind of walked that back and saying that they're not getting rid of it. But the point has been made that so much of the narrative that we get doesn't tell the story of marriage. I think that's that's absolutely important. There's a great book called The Good News About Marriage, written by Sean T. Feldhahn, who's an amazing author and researched, really digging into the data around divorce. And, most of the listeners have probably heard the expression that the divorce rate is half of all marriages end in divorce. And that's been reported so many times that it's believed to be canonical. And she went in her research to try to track that one statistic and found that that's not true and it's never actually been true. Odds are, something like 65% of all marriages last a lifetime. Now you'd say, there's still a lot that end in divorce. That's true. But just being able to say most marriages last a lifetime is a big difference from a messaging perspective and a cultural storytelling perspective. When so many people think, why would I get married? Because so many marriages end in failure, right? So this is a cultural storytelling is an area where we need to find ways to engage, and we can complain about Hollywood, or we can find new ways. The cost for storytelling has never gotten so inexpensive. We have a partnership. I don't think you know this, with American Private Radio and their national radio show, Our American Stories. And it's approaching 3 million weekly listeners now, and it's a storytelling show. And it's exactly on this whole thing. It's on over 300 affiliates now across the country, and just picked up in major affiliates in Los Angeles and Dallas and Houston, and no political talk. And it's all just great edifying stories that are for a secular audience. We have a regular segment on there on Relationship Story Hour, which is all about telling great stories of redemption, of real stories, of real people who have come through our churches that have been through great and awful struggles in their marriage and their relationship, and came through it better for persevering. And so we're obviously believers in the importance of storytelling and are trying to engage in that area, but others need to.
Very good. Amen. JP Gance, founder and president of Communio. JP, where can people find you and Communio online?
Folks can find me on at communio.org, our website, communio.org. We're also on Facebook, of course, and you can find our Facebook page, and we post a lot of relationship health ideas and ideas for couples on our Facebook page. So if you want to go ahead and like our page, you can do that. And we also have an e-newsletter, the Communio Minute, and you can sign up for that on our website.
And people should also be on the lookout for, I think you told me you have a co-authored book coming out possibly in May.
That's right. We've got really a book focused on the church's mission in the 21st century, and that the most effective way for churches to evangelize in the 21st century, we believe, is going to be through marriage and focusing there as a way to make disciples and spread the gospel.
JP Gance, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jeremy.